after I came back to Korea. I've never looked at it. And just today, I just pulled it from the bookshelf. Then I looked at it again for the first time since 2004. Right? Because the topic is coming back. This topic is coming back. But from a very paradoxical way. The topic has come back, the resource curse, particularly in Russia. This has come back not because Russia is going to experience the boom again, but this time Russia might be experiencing the bust this time. So exactly the opposite way, this topic is attracting scholarly interest. So this time, I think very exciting time. In the 1990s, when I was doing research about this, I think the kinds of time horizon we were having at that time was very limited. Because looking back at the 1990s, from today's perspective, the decade of 90s was, sort of a bust period for Russia and many oil exporting countries because oil prices were on the average throughout the 1990s between 10 and 15, right? Basically, I think most of the oil exporting countries, they were struggling, right? In terms of barely sustaining their system due to oil prices, right? Do you remember the resource curse problems facing those oil exporting countries, the fluctuations, right? So decade of 90s was low oil prices, right? So when I was analyzing Russia in the 1990s, which is the subject of this book, Russia in the 1990s basically experiencing, right, low oil prices, sort of technically the bust period, right? Now, the decade of 2000s, the opposite, right? The booming period. A lot of money flowed into the Russian government. And issue, from today's perspective, how Russians manage it, right? The boom, the resource boom. So that whether or not Russia contracted the Dutch disease or political resource curse. As we have learned from last class, two aspects of resource curse: political resource curse, economic resource curse. Right? Some societal aspect, but mainly two kinds of diseases. Right? Political disease, economic disease, although they are related, connected. Right? Economic resource curse is casually called Dutch disease. Right? Dutch disease. So the issue today, I think, is whether or not Russia was and still is sick with the Dutch disease. One, right? Economic resource curse. Did Russia suffer from economic resource curse? And second, did Russia suffer political resource curse? Right? And more hypothetical question is, without oil and gas, this is a stupid question, without oil and gas, if Russia had not been dependent on oil and gas, decade of 2000s, would Russia have been better off? This is a stupid question, but right? So if oil prices go down again, is Russia going to be more democratic, right? Or if oil prices go down, maybe after, right? Second decade of, maybe around 2020, right? If oil prices go down, is Russia going to be better off in terms of economic management and in terms of democratic development, right? So what we have to do, today's focus is, I think, following up on African example. We didn't look deeply into all the African individual cases, But African individual cases, I think, why people are more attracted to the Russian case, because African examples is just too obvious, right? There's just two obvious problems there, right? Clearly. But Russian example is much more interesting than Nigeria, than maybe Angola and other African countries, or even Saudi Arabia. Russia is much more interesting from resource curse perspective, because Russian example is just, it's not like a obvious example of resource curse, okay? So just Russia is at the boundary, right? So that's why Russia is very interesting. So Russia has a lot of potential for escaping the resource curse, right? Nigeria may be a very bleak perspective, bleak prospect for escaping the resource curse. So relatively uninteresting, the Nigerian case, right? But Russian case is interesting because if Russia manages and changes some policies or institutions, right, little bit, then Russia can escape it. That's why Russia is much more interesting. And good experimentation, right? Much more interesting than Nigerian sample and African sample. So today I think we should look at the Russian case. As I said, it was quite fashionable research in the early 2000s. Then put aside a little bit, then it's getting a lot of attention again. And Central Asian example, like Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, those are kind of a new kind of research projects for many countries. And I see many good reports and scholarly articles from Germany. A lot of German scholars, they are into this research. A lot of German scholars. And German research think tanks, they publish. I read many good ones from Germany, like GIGA, G-I-G-A. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. GIGA, they produce a lot of good resource curse articles on Russia and particularly on Central Asian countries. Germany, right, is intensely interested in the resource curse in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, right? Again, very interesting cases, good experimentation, Central Asian countries. And Norway. Norway is also very big on this research. Very high quality research articles. Norway has two world research think tanks. One is FNI, Fridtjof Nansen Institute, and second is Norwegian Institute of Defense Studies. Both of them are really top, super top at a global level. Although a little bit different from American research style. But in terms of quality, in terms of the quantity of research, those two Norwegian institutions are really one of top, and German, right? So Germany, Norway, they are leading this resource curse. Now, before we begin, I think we should repeat and make sure we are on the same page, because I have tossed out a lot of information last class. Why don't we redefine the resource curse, then the contributing factors, right? So once we define the resource curse, then the reasons, causes for resource curse, that's important, right? So we covered what are the political aspect, economic aspect of resource curse. Why don't we reiterate some of the points we made, which is important. I emphasized last class, there are 4 symptoms of the Dutch disease, okay? when countries are sick with Dutch disease, they tend to develop these kinds of symptoms, one of these symptoms, or all of these symptoms. One is when a country suffers Dutch disease, right? They rely too much on resource exports. They suffer exchange rate appreciation. Currency tends to appreciate. That's one problem, right? Most often cited problem by many scholars. Currency appreciates if you rely on resource exports or single sector. I took Korean example. If Korea relies too much on Samsung, right, semiconductor exports, Korea might suffer same problem. So every country, when they rely on a certain sector, right, specific sector, this problem occurs. Currency appreciates. Second problem, I mentioned many times, manufacturing decline. Manufacturing sector decline. It can be also called deindustrialization. Right? Country tends to deindustrialize this. Right? Very glaring example from Nigeria. Right? Nigeria, when they began to export oil, there was a dramatic collapse of agricultural sector. Right? So that Nigerians began to import food, rice, and other food crops. Right? This is the best example of how manufacturing sector or agricultural sector decline because of, right, dependence on energy exports. Second, I didn't emphasize this much. This is, like I said, these are just stylized facts. If you look up the resource curves in the economic dictionary, these will come out because these are almost standardized facts. So manufacturing decline, and second, service sector growth. This might sound a little bit strange. Service sector growth. This might not be a bad thing, right? When service sector grows, this is, I think, natural evolution of, right, any economic development. But service means here energy-related service, right? Banking, insurance, and all this technical service. When these grow, I think it's a good thing. But service means here energy-related, mostly energy-related service. The idea behind this, why manufacturing, agricultural die, and why services grow is migration of labor, right? Wage differential, right? Wages grow in the energy-related sector so that labor from the manufacturing industry, migrate into booming sector, right? Although I think this aspect must be studied further from contemporary perspective, because these Dutch disease theories, like I said, originate from old economic studies from the economy of the Netherlands in the 1960s. Although it changed over time, but basic assumption behind this very similar to the 60s, 70s, right? Economics in the 60s and 70s. The service, like I said, this is one of stylized facts. Service, we need to look much more in detail, right? What service sector they meant, but from textbook definition, from the economic textbook from the 60s, this is included, okay? Last one. In general, wage growth occurs in general, okay? Because the economy tends to be inflationary due to booming energy sector. Particularly in the energy-related sector, wage grows. Finally, institutional problems. I added this. More recent study tends to focus on these problems, institutional problems, right? And institutional economics they contributed to this type of research. So institution means corruption, right? Tax capacity, or property rights, right? Legal system. Like if a country, many African countries, they suffer institutional weakness in terms of the ability to tax energy companies, right? The government doesn't know how much more money these foreign investors or domestic oil companies make, right? They don't know how to tax these companies, right? Because high oil price period, companies they make more money, right? But the government doesn't know how much money they make additional income, right? So that the government, because the tax capacity is so weak, right? This is the problem. When I was writing this book, one of the main problems facing Russia at the time in the 1990s was that the conflict over these additional incomes, right, due to oil price increases. There's intense conflict between the government, right, taxing government, and energy companies, foreign and domestic. Right? So the argument here, resource-based economies, they tend to develop the tax capacity much later, right, than non-oil-based, non-resource-based economy. That's the argument, right? And I think property rights, many write about property rights problems. Property rights meaning, rules about, how foreigners invest, right, in the oil and gas industries. Sometimes the rules are not transparent, right? Sometimes the authorities, the government, change these rules overnight, so that foreign investors, they don't know. I mean, they have very weak, low level of trust, right, in the rules and governance system, right? So that's institution. So this is more recent kind of problems that scholars pay a lot of attention. So these are common symptoms. So 4 or 5, right? Common symptoms that resource-based economies tend to contract. Now, having said this, I think the other aspect is how to resolve the problem, right? That's the next step. How to escape as a government, right? One of the arguments I think I made last class was, right, when you rely on resource exports, right, it goes against common sense, but statistically speaking, you tend to suffer more than non-resource-based economies, right? But there are ways, right? There are ways like Norway, like Canada, like the United States, or like Botswana, right? Like Sierra Leone, or like Indonesia. Some of those success cases, there are ways in which you can escape it, right? I'm not saying, I didn't say it was 100%, non-curable disease, right? There are ways. If you introduce good policies, right? If you introduce good policies, if you reform the institutions, right? If you reform the institutions, you can escape it. That was the basic assumption. Then what policies you have to introduce? That's I think, right? That's the important thing. What policies and what institutions you should put in place. To escape from those problems, you need to first make sure that you escape external vulnerability. I think that's what we emphasize, external vulnerability. most of the problems, I think one of the basic problems facing these export-based countries, resource-based countries, they have internal problems, but mostly the biggest problem comes from the outside. Price fluctuation, right? The oil market or natural gas market is so fluctuating, right? So as a country, if you want to export more, you export, but at the same time, you need to make sure you are protected from the price fluctuations, market fluctuations, because the market itself is so cyclical, right? So there were booming times, like 10 years, right? Then after the booming times, right, the other cycle, right, sets in, like bust period sets in. So this is historical fact, right? No exception. No exception. How long interval? It depends, but there is no exception. When there are good times, there are really bad times. So as a country, you need to protect, right, yourselves from this price fluctuation, right? To protect the country from this external vulnerability, many things were recommended, right? Many things were recommended. But first, I think you need to have good fiscal policy. You need to have good fiscal policy. It's good if you could change the market, oil market, but if you cannot change the market, right? One of the passive policies is to maintain tight fiscal policy. Save it for rainy days. That's the lesson, right? So stabilization fund is a good example, right? When you earn money, save it. Put it into some account, right? So that no one touches it, right? That's stabilization fund. It's kind of interesting. I mean, oil production began a long time ago, but these problems were detected quite recently, like 60s. And that detection occurred in the Netherlands, in one of advanced countries, not in Africa or not in Russia. And these poor countries took the lesson from one of the advanced countries, right? Then the 70s, 80s, they knew academically, but they didn't apply it in real policies. I think the only time these developing poor kind of resource exporting countries, when they really apply these academic lessons to real policy, is actually 2000s, right? So only in the 2000s did these resource-based poor countries learn how to escape the resource curse, right? Before then, they knew it academically, but in real policies, they didn't know how to introduce these policies, right? So this is really, really recent, I think, type of policy issue. Stabilization fund, again, Russia and many Middle Eastern, even African, Central Asian countries, they had a big debate about stabilization fund. I don't know how many of them, but many of them today have some nominal level of this policy, stabilization fund, including Russia, right? Even Kazakhstan, even Azerbaijan, they all have this stabilization fund. I think what is important is how to manage the fund, right? What is important is not just, establish the fund. More important than the establishment of the fund is how to manage the fund, right? Politically, the fund must be protected from interest group, right? Conflicts. The management of the fund must be very rigorous, right? And politically free, which is difficult in weak countries, in fact. So first, protect it from external vulnerability. This is, I think, one of the surest way to escape the Dutch disease. And we look at it through the Russian case shortly. Right? Russia relatively successful in this respect. Second, diversification. We mentioned this already last time. Diversification. You need to diversify the economy. Right? You need to diversify away from, right, the sector, the single important sector, which is resource exports, then into, right, manufacturing, and maybe including real service industry, including finance, banking, right, those sectors. Through subsidies, right, to these new sectors, including agricultural sector. This is a tricky question, and how Russia managed this diversification problem. This is one of the most interesting questions. I mean, it's interesting how the Russian government managed like a currency issue or stabilization fund, or really, I mean, Dutch disease kind of management is important, but this is a much more interesting aspect of how Russia escaped the resource curse. You know, the share of manufacturing industry in the Russian economy, right? How fantastic topic is that? In terms of doing research, it's not easy to really measure the ratio of Russian oil and gas industry. Exact number doesn't exist, right? Although we have rough figures on this, we'll look at it sooner or later, shortly. So whether or not Russia has successfully diversified, or according to theory, Russian manufacturing industry must have shrunk during the 2000s, the decade of 2000s, because those are booming period, right? Huge opportunities for oil and gas exports. So according to theory, Russian manufacturing industry must have shrunk the decade of 2000s, right? So we look into whether or not this is the case, or manufacturing industry expanded while exporting oil and gas, right? That's I think interesting point about this. And diversification about the Middle Eastern economy, we cover a little bit, right? Or North Africa, right? Countries that went through the Arab Spring, Egypt, Libya, those economies. I mentioned some diversification is going on in this MENA region. And those countries that experienced Arab Spring, it's kind of interesting to compare the economic structure and political development, right? Political openings such as Arab Spring. Those countries that experienced Arab Spring, they tend to have diversified economies, right? Away from resource exports. That's what diversification sort of went on in the MENA region. And we look today how Russian diversification went on, right, in the decade of 2000. Thirdly, Dutch disease, right? Dutch disease. Like how to manage currency appreciation, I mean, those issues, right? You need to, right, protect the fiscal policy from currency appreciation. You know. Second, political resource curse. Okay, let's repeat a little bit. then what's the political resource curse? Political resource curse, I think, is summed up in a very interesting, like, axiom proposed by Thomas Friedman. Right? He said there is inverse relationship between oil prices and democracy. Right? So resource abundance undermines democracy. This is the assumption behind political resource curse. The process of mechanism of how resource abundance undermines democracy through several processes. I emphasize, booming resource sector undermines state institutional development, and relationship between, and myopia and extravagance. I mean, the attitude, right? And finally, rentier state. The state becomes a rentier state. Then tax and accountability problem. We mentioned this. Okay. So I laid out, right, the political resource curse, economic resource curse, how to escape the resource curse. First, I think before we discuss the Russian resource curse, the case of Russia, I think that we need to first look at the structure of the Russian economy, the Russian resource-based economy, right? How dependent is Russian economy on resources, right? How much, from comparative perspective, right? Some interesting figures I brought here. A little bit old data. This is the share of fuel exports, oil and gas, share of oil and gas exports as of 2006. Russia, here, 19% of GDP. Okay. Again, there are different measures and different figures. This is oil and gas exports against percent of GDP, right? Remember, you can also have energy exports in terms of share of revenues, government revenues, right? Then that number, percent of government revenues, this must be much higher than this, right? This is percent of GDP, right? GDP production. 19%, which is a little bit higher than Belarus, right? A little bit lower than Belarus. And Norway, 25. Singapore, 26, right? Kazakhstan, 32. Then Azerbaijan, 52. Saudi Arabia, 54. Oman, 55. UAE, 56. One of Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, 56. And Brunei, 64. 64%. I don't have figure for percent of revenues or percent of exports. This is another type of figures. Right? And as I recall, Russian number for percent of exports higher than 50%. Right? Higher than 50%. Officially, in IMF definition, in order to become a resource-dependent economy, right? The ceiling is 10% of GDP. If the economy relies on 10% of GDP, that's resource-dependent economy, according to IMF definition. And in terms of share of exports, if the economy relies on 40% of exports, that's resource-dependent economy. So 10% of GDP, 40% of exports, that makes resource-dependent economy, according to IMF. So Russia is enough to become a resource-dependent economy, right? Because the minimum definition is 10% of GDP, right? These are minimum countries, right? 10 is minimum definition to become a resource-dependent. 40% of exports, minimum definition. Russia is enough to become a resource-dependent economy. This number is in terms of per capita, right? Resource incomes in terms of per capita, right? Because Russian population is bigger, right? Only $1,340 per capita, which is much smaller than Saudi, like 8,000 per capita resource income. And I think UAE, I mean, a lot higher, 21,000, right? And this is important number, resource income per capita, because it will determine the energy policy of different countries. Those countries are, right, really wealthy countries from resource exports perspective, right? So that their pricing policy, right, more or less determined by probably this, right? Countries like UAE and countries like Qatar, their pricing policy will be not high oil prices, right? Because they have a lot of room. They would like ask for much lower, right? Mid or lower type of energy pricing policy, right? Whereas these countries are much more, right, urgent in terms of revenue incomes. So within the OPEC, they might, ask for higher oil price levels. Okay. Next, again, in terms of the structure of the Russian economy, this black one is oil industry, right? The white one, gas industry. Income from, right, oil industry, income from gas industry, and income from other resource sectors, right? Other resource sectors like minerals, right? So if you look at this, income from the oil, income from natural gas was very small in 2001, and over time increases. And the majority of incomes, right, like I said, comes from oil exports. Here. And right. In 2001, right, in terms of government, I'm not sure whether this is 100%, this is whether government revenues or export structure, oil and gas exports in 2001 combined to, right, comprise maybe a little more than 40%, right, in terms of exports or government incomes. Over time increases, maybe 59 almost, gas and oil exports combined. A little bit lower here, right? And the entire energy exports, 65, almost 78, right? This is Russian economy, right? The entire energy exports, almost 70 or 80%, depends on different year. Again, different figures. Oops. Okay. Again, different presentation. Petroleum 40%. Okay. As of 2004, oil exports 40%. natural gas 14%, iron and steel 7%, right? Non-ferrous metal 6%. And interestingly, manufacturing goods except iron, steel, and these mineral, right? 16%. Share of industry in Russia. As of 2004, according to this author, 16%. It differs a little bit from reading to reading. Some readings say even 19%, 20%. Right? Share of manufacturing, share of industry, 16%, and other 9%. This is not my fault. Somehow this is strange. Maybe. Okay. Right. Another. Some characteristics of leading oil producers, including more diverse indicators. Like this is manufacturing share, right? Again, here Russia is 18%, Venezuela 18%, Canada 17%, right? Things like that. And services sector, Russia quite high, 59%, almost same as Norway, right? And I don't think this is a good indicator of how advanced the economy is, because even Kazakhstan is quite well advanced in terms of service sector. And this indicator, education, percent of enrollment for tertiary school. In terms of education, because many argue that I didn't include it, in terms of how to escape the resource curse. If you read the scholarly articles, many suggest that you need to invest in education. To escape the long-term solution to the resource curse is to invest in education. They emphasize this a lot. Probably that's why they have this indicator. Here, Russia, relatively, right? They are doing well in terms of education, 70%, right? And if you go down the list, poor performers are Middle East and Latin America, right? Among the resource exporting group, those are poor performers. Qatar is really worse here. Oman, right? They have, yet to improve. Most of the Middle Eastern countries, they are really underperforming in terms of this education investment. This is outlier, Libya 51%. I don't know what's happening there. Why Libya 51%? Kazakhstan 43%. One of the best performers here. Saudi Arabia, not good. Right? And scientific articles per million people. Best country, Denmark. Denmark publishes 918 articles per 1 million people. Right? The best country in terms of article publication. Canada, Norway, Russia. Right? There's a big gap between Russia and other top 3 countries, but still Russia ranked 4 as 107 articles. Then Kuwait, UAE, Oman. This shows, they are making some investment into research, R&D, these top Middle Eastern exporters. Among the really wealthy Middle Eastern countries, Qatar is really, bad in terms of scientific research. Then researchers in R&D, same indicator. Right. Russia, on all, in many aspects, relatively high ranked, right, in terms of education and research. Kazakhstan relatively doing well in terms of research. And number of women working. Kazakhstan, highest rank. Is this right? 43% labor force, female. In fact, right, this may be true. Many universities may be different in other sectors. Many universities, if you visit Kazakh universities, high-ranked professors, they tend to be women than men. Colleges, female professors in Korea, very few. Right? High school, yes, maybe high school. Middle school, really yes. Elementary, dominating. Elementary school, but if you go up the ladder of education, less and less women, particularly colleges, right? College professors, that's the domain of male professors, not women. But I found Kazakhstan the other way around. I saw many deans and chairs of department. They tend to be women. Yeah. Even political science, top Kazakh National University, chair of the political science department, historically they tend to be women. I met the current chair, previous chair, previous chair, all women. Political science department. We have many women working actually in companies and really top companies, but still the income gap. They do the same work, right? But women get 2/3 of what men gets, like entry level. You graduate from college, right? Then you recruited from Samsung, right? And you get paid differently. Women get paid differently. And banks, these are good jobs for college graduates in Korea. Banks, they pay differently. It's a sad story, right? So on the average, 2/3 or even less, right? So Korea is one of the worst performers in terms of, and government jobs, it's pathetic. Really few women working in the government, particularly high ranking. Although it's changing, right? Traditional government jobs really go to men, right? And even higher ranked positions really go to men, like a minister, vice minister, or director level, almost no women, right? Although it's changing, like foreign ministry, there are a lot of young diplomats, women, female diplomats. It says something because foreign service exam is purely based on exam, right? Merit-based recruitment system. And in colleges, one of the problems in Korea is that freshmen, particularly popular departments, one of the problems they find as a professor in popular department is that the imbalance between girls and women, girls and boys. More and more girls are recruited as new students in popular departments, which says in high school and also in middle school, women they tend to study more. Women in Korea, maybe the same in other countries. Women, girl students, they tend to study more. They tend to perform better in class, so that they tend to be admitted into good colleges and good departments. So in good colleges, good department, there is imbalance, right? Gender imbalance. And this gender imbalance in good departments, good colleges, translates into maybe more women recruited by good, maybe organizations. And foreign ministry is a good example. And justice department, right? Judges. Again, judges in Korea, 100% recruited based on exam scores, right? Really rigorous exam scores. Then we have more women than men being recruited, right? Judges and diplomats. So we have more women, right? And when I go to foreign ministry meetings, there are a lot of young girls, in the offices, in Korean foreign ministry. And I don't know whether that's a problem or not, but some say it's becoming a problem within the Korean foreign ministry. And why it is a problem? Well, it's right. That's the point man's making. Right. 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 I mean, the Korean president is women, right? Korean president is a lady, and the Korea is now in a crisis, right? Leadership crisis. Some say it's a leadership crisis because the way the government leads the country is oftentimes the current government is compared to previous governments. Like the way the president makes policies and leads different ministries is often compared to previous governments. And some say it's different. Maybe the difference comes from the gender. Right? Women tend to focus on details, right? Women tend to focus on details. And this lady tends to be very focused, agenda focused, so that she doesn't leave it to ministers, right? So that's kind of leadership she shows, doesn't leave it to her fellow ministers, so that she's always in the center, right? So that no one except her has decision-making power. So this time, the disaster, right? The ship, like a sinking disaster, sort of shows one of these problems. Like at the disaster site, no one, right, has the control over the situation, so that the time just passes without someone saying, right, definitively, you do that, right? You do this, you do that. No one did that before the president comes. So this is one of the problems. Probably not. This is not the problem of a lady president, but clearly there's a leadership crisis. The way this country is led is in a crisis, and corruption is one of the problems, I think. Right? So it's beyond, right, leadership problem. The entire country, I think. The same problems we were discussing, like a institution problem, right? So the Korean economy must be looked at institutional economics perspective. We found that this country is built on a very shaky institutional setting, very shaky. And when the institution is weak, then the president wills strong leadership, right? And this is combined, right? We saw what results come out. We saw that, right? What is important is rather the president alone is strong, but the entire structure must be strong rather than the president, right? Maybe this is a cultural issue. I mean, Korea, this is also a problem with Russia. Russia, they don't imagine a situation where president is weak, right? They need strong president, strong leader, right? Korea, same. I mean, we Koreans, in blood, we need some strong president. We used to have strong president, but that's Korea, and Korea lost a lot this time. The economy is really depressed. That's the biggest, I think, concern about this disaster, like 911. Right? People compare 911 and this Korean disaster. But this disaster and 911 may be different from some perspective. 911 is, in a sense, I think 911 mobilized American citizens because America was attacked by the outside enemy, right? So that sort of stimulated Americans, a lot of Americans, right? And the president, right, mobilized, right, the citizens. But this time, really different. If Korea were attacked by North Korea, then story becomes different, right? But this is Korea attacked by Korea, right? Not Korea attacked by North Korea. Korea attacked by Korea because we built a very corrupt system. We didn't know that. We were living off of very corrupt bureaucrats, right? Corrupt bureaucrats, corrupt police. The entire system is highly corrupted. We knew that, right? So I think that what we should do, based on all this, get to the real business of the Russian resource curse. Time has passed. First, I think that the book I wrote 10 years ago, this is derived from the dissertation I wrote 2000, and I developed it for additional 3 years. Then this book was published by the Ashgate. Ashgate showed interest, particular interest in this topic. So it published 2003, and still, I mean, this book is still being sold. And, you know, even to libraries, American libraries, how many college libraries, a lot of college libraries, they buy this. And if you type in my name, Google, the first item that is pulled is this one still, 10 years after, which means that still this book is being sold, right? Because this was the first book that looked at Russia from resource curse perspective. Because resource curse was still Middle Eastern study or African study. No one before me looked at Russia from resource curse perspective. You know, after me, there have been several researches, and even more today. Today, the book you have to read. First, I think you need to have a look at this book, right? Buy it. Then I think the book you really have to read today is this book. I really recommend this book if you are interested in this topic. This one. I think this came out quite recently. When was it? 2012. The Oil Curse. The Oil Curse by Michael Ross. professor in the Department of Political Science, UCLA, Michael Ross. He's one of the most active political scientists working on the political resource curves. Right? So this book he does, right, how petroleum wealth, same thing, how resource abundance shapes the development of nations. It's a comparative study. Comparative study. He looks at, you know, Middle Eastern countries, African countries. He looks at Russia, Central Asia. It's a good comparative study. So he's the best scholar on this topic. And it's interesting. I mean, like I said, resource curves is the area for economists traditionally, rather than political scientists. But it's rapidly becoming a subject for political science due to his contribution. Michael Ross, very active, good speaker. You can read it from Google. It's available. Amazing. Google. There's a text, right? Entire text is available from Google site. You can read it, but you cannot copy it and paste it, but you can read from page 1 to the end. Amazing book. It's a good book. Best one. I haven't seen any good books by economists recently on this topic, resource curves. There were many in the 1990s, like Jeffrey Sachs, right? Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most active economists on this topic. Then Andrew Warner, right? And their cases in the 1990s, cases were Latin America at the time. Latin America were interesting cases for economists. And Richard O.T., again, economist. And Alan Gelb, economist. Right? But I haven't seen any big research done by economists on this resource curves topic lately. This is the most outstanding study. Good news, because political scientists did it, right? Who was it? The Nobel laureate economist. Who? No. One of the anti-globalization economists from, used to be working at World Bank, now at Stanford. Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph Stiglitz, I think he went into this field several years ago. And you might want to track down any work he did since then. Right, he has some work as an economist. But as a political scientist, this is the most outstanding book, worthwhile to read it. And and I have uploaded this PowerPoint and one article. So if you want to read it, check the website, right? The portal, university portal. That there will be PowerPoint and this article. Can Russia break the resource curves? You might want to read it. And why don't we continue? I think that I want to discuss the final segment of this resource curves topic Monday again. But the focus will be on Central Asia. We have to finish up Russia, then let's discuss Central Asia resource curves Monday. Then Wednesday, we'll shift to chapter 13 of this book, which is Asian energy, like China, Japan, Korea, Russia. These will be the final segment, final topic for this class in this semester. Then we will have second quiz at the end of May. Then leave the rest of time for your research paper in the 2 weeks of June, right? Initial beginning 2 weeks of June. I leave it for the writing of your research paper. Okay.